She hid that her first husband was the sheriff. Rancher never asked, never left. The first thing I noticed about her hands was that she knew how to work a pump handle. Not the delicate push and pull most town women do, like they're afraid the thing'll bite them. She pulled it down hard with her whole shoulder, filled the bucket clean, and carried it without spilling a drop. I was watching from the hayloft, and I thought, whoever taught her that did her a kindness. That was the first day she came out to the Aldrin place, which was mine by then, mine and the bank's, though I tried not to think too hard about that second part. Her name was Nora Cal. She'd answered the notice I'd tacked to the post office door asking for someone to cook and keep the house, because I'd been living on hardtack and whatever I could fry up in a pan for going on 3 years, and my ribs were starting to show it. I didn't know anything else about her then. Didn't ask. A man gets to a certain age, he stops asking questions he doesn't need the answers to. She was maybe 35. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less. I was never good at guessing that, and she had one of those faces that held itself still enough it was hard to read. Brown hair going lighter at the temples. Serious eyes, gray-green, the kind that take things in more than they give out. She wore a dark wool dress that had been washed so many times it had gone soft as flannel, and she moved like someone who'd long since gotten over the idea that anyone was watching her. She said she'd been in Burrow Creek for 2 years, and before that she'd lived up in Millhaven, which was 60 miles north. She said she had experience keeping a house and cooking for men, though she said it plain, not like she was offering anything other than exactly what those words meant. I said the job paid $12 a month with meals included, and she said that was fine, and when could she start? I said Monday if she liked. She said Monday was fine. That was all. I went back to splitting fence rails. She walked the mile back into town. She started Monday. The house had been my father's. He'd built it in 1861 out of whatever lumber the territory would give him, which wasn't much, so the walls were never quite square and the kitchen floor had a list to it that said a rolling pin going if you weren't careful. I'd been meaning to fix it for years. I told her that. She said she'd wet the table leg. She did, and I never thought about the floor again. She was quiet in a way that suited me. I'd had a wife, my first wife, Ellen, who died of a fever in the winter of '78. That was 9 years before Nora came. 9 years is long enough that you stop expecting to be lonely and start just being it, which is different. Lonely is something you feel acutely. What I had was more like an absence that had become ordinary. Like a finger you'd lost so long ago you didn't miss it anymore. Just occasionally went to use it and found it gone. I didn't try to fill that absence with conversation. Neither did she. We ate breakfast at 6, she kept the kitchen, I worked the land. I had 400 acres of grassland and cottonwood draws, a herd of maybe 80 cattle, 2 horses, and a mule named Ira who was older than God and about as patient. In the evenings I came in, she had supper on the table, real food, the kind you could taste, and sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't, and either way was all right. What I remember about those early weeks is small things. The smell of biscuits in a cold morning kitchen. The way she'd left my good gloves on the windowsill to dry after she'd washed them, fingers spread, so they'd keep their shape. The one time I came in from the north pasture in a driving rain and found she'd put a dry shirt on the peg by the door for me, which I hadn't asked her to do and which I didn't mention to her, just took it down and put it on without a word. Small things. A man my age knows that small things are how you tell. I started noticing other things too. The way she'd go quiet if I mentioned Burrow Creek's old sheriff, Cutter Haynes, who died that spring, just a beat too long before she'd say something else. The way she never went into town on Saturdays, even when I offered to drive her in. The way she'd sometimes stand at the east window in the evenings and look out at the road for a minute before she'd catch herself doing it and go back to whatever she'd been doing. I didn't ask, it wasn't my business. People come to the frontier with the kinds of histories they'd rather not wave around, and I'd never been a man who believed he had the right to pick through another person's past like it was goods in a dry goods store. She did good work. She was honest. She was kind to Ira, who was arthritic and bad-tempered about it, and she'd started bringing him half an apple in the mornings, which he'd warmed to faster than he'd warmed to me in 10 years. That was enough. It was October, going on 2 months since she'd started, when Roy Decker came out to the ranch. Roy was a deputy over in Millhaven. He was maybe 40, stout with a face like a side of dried beef and a silver badge he polished more than the work warranted. He rode up to the gate on a Tuesday afternoon when I was working the south pasture, and he sat his horse and waited in a way that meant he knew I could see him. I came up slow. I didn't know him then, just knew the badge. He said he was looking for a woman named Nora Haynes. Had she come through here? I said I had a woman named Nora Cal keeping house for me. He said Cal was her maiden name. Her married name was Haynes. I said I didn't know anything about that, and what business did he have with her? He gave me a look that men with badges give when they think they know more than you. Said she was the widow of Sheriff Lewis Haynes of Millhaven, deceased, and that there was a question about the estate and some property that needed settling, and did I know where she was? I said if she was somewhere on this ranch, which I didn't know for a fact, she'd tell me if she wanted to talk to him. He said I was being difficult. I said I was being clear, which was different. He rode off. I stood there in the pasture for a while after his dust cleared. Sheriff Lewis Haynes. She'd been married to the sheriff of Millhaven, and she hadn't said a word about it. 2 months of breakfasts and suppers, and not a word. I didn't feel cheated. That's the strange thing. I stood there and checked myself, really looked at what I was feeling, and it wasn't betrayal or anger. It was more like the feeling you get when you find a deep cut on an animal you've been watching, a cut you'd missed because it had already scarred over. A kind of sorrow for the wound, not anger at the hiding. She was at the kitchen table when I came in, mending one of my shirts. She looked up when I walked in and she saw it in my face immediately, saw that something had happened, that someone had come, and she went still in the way I'd come to recognize, that careful stillness that was her way of getting ready. I sat down across from her. I didn't dance around it. I said, "A deputy from Millhaven came asking for a woman named Nora Haynes. Said your husband was the sheriff there." She put the shirt down on the table. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up at me. She said, "Yes." I said, "Is there something I need to know? Anything that would put this ranch or anyone on it in a bad position?" She said, "No." She said she hadn't done anything wrong. She said Lewis had died in a dispute over water rights, and the land and what he'd owned had gone to a cousin in Cheyenne, as Lewis had never changed his will. And there were people in Millhaven who decided it suited them to believe she'd had something to do with his death, because it was easier than sitting with the fact that Lewis had made a lot of enemies, and one of them had finally acted on it. She said she'd left because there was nothing left to stay for, and because she couldn't keep going into a mercantile and reading it on people's faces. I listened to all of that. Then I said, "All right." She looked at me, just looked at me. I'd said 2 words, and she looked at me like I'd handed her something she'd been carrying the weight of for 2 years. I said, "Do you want me to drive Roy Decker off my land if he comes back, or would you rather just talk to him and settle it?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're not going to ask me anything else?" I said, "I don't need to." She looked back down at her hands. She didn't say anything for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful, like she was checking the ice before she put her weight on it. She said Lewis was a fair man in most ways, but he didn't see me. Not really. He saw what he needed to see, a woman who could keep his house and stand at his side and be what a sheriff's wife was supposed to be. He was kind enough, he was just absent, even when he was in the room. She said I thought it was just how it was, being married. I didn't say anything to that. She said I'd been here 2 months and I thought maybe I should go, before you found out on your own, before you'd feel like you'd been lied to. I nearly did twice. I said, "What stopped you?" She thought about it. She said, "This ranch." She stopped. She said, "You." She said it plain, not like an admission wrung out of her, just like a fact she decided to say out loud. I sat with that for a minute. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the fat pine smell of the walls, and outside the wind was picking up, and the loose shutter on the north side was starting to knock. Same as any other Tuesday evening. I said, "Well, you can stay as long as you want to." She nodded. She picked the shirt back up. That was all we said that night. But something had shifted, the way the air shifts before a weather change, not the weather itself, just the feeling that something was coming that you wouldn't be able to stop even if you wanted to. I didn't want to stop it. That was the surprising part. Roy Decker came back on a Friday. This time I was at the gate when he rode up because I'd been expecting him. I told him the woman he was looking for wasn't available to speak with him, and that he could file whatever papers he needed to file through the county office in Larimer, and we'd respond through proper channels. He said I didn't understand what he was there for. I said I understood fine. I was standing at the fence post with my arms crossed, and I didn't move, and after a minute he seemed to decide that the ride back to Millhaven was more appealing than whatever came next, and he left. When I came back and she was in the doorway, she'd seen the whole thing from there. I said, "He won't come back." She said, "You don't know that." I said, "No, but he looked like a man who'd rather let a thing lie than keep spending the effort. Some men are like that." She was looking at me the way she'd looked at me that night at the kitchen table. Steady, like she was measuring something. I didn't know what she was measuring. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Don't mention it." I went back to work, or I tried to. I got about 40 yards toward the barn before I heard her call my name. I turned around and she was still standing in the doorway. She said, "I think you're the best man I've known. I'm not saying that to be kind. I'm saying it because it's true and because I think you should know it." She went back inside before I could answer her, which was probably lucky because I didn't have an answer. My chest did something I hadn't felt in a long time, not a hurt, just a fullness, the kind that's almost uncomfortable because you've gone so long without it. I stood there for a minute in the October cold, hands in my pockets, looking at the closed door. November came and brought hard frost, and the work of moving the cattle down from the summer pasture to the lower ground. I was out for 3 days on that, sleeping in the bedroll I kept behind the saddle and eating from the saddlebag. And when I came back, the house was warm, and there was a stew on the stove that she'd kept going slow all day against my coming back. And on the table was a cup of coffee poured and waiting. She came in from the back room when she heard my boots on the porch. She said, "How were the high pastures?" I said, "Cold." Said Ira had thrown a shoe on the second day and I'd had to go slow. She said, "Sit down, you look half frozen." I sat down and she put the stew in front of me and sat down across, and we talked for an hour about nothing in particular. The condition of the north fence, whether the winter would come early, a letter she'd gotten from a woman in Burrow Creek who'd asked her to help teach reading at the schoolhouse come spring. She said she was thinking about saying yes, if I didn't need her here on those mornings. I said, "Do it, you be good at it." She smiled. It was a slow smile, took its time getting there. Not the polite smile she'd worn the first few weeks, which had been a smile for anyone, but something else, something particular. That was the first time I thought, this is something. I'm not a man who rushes himself into feelings or says things he hasn't worked over first. I'd been working this over since October, and it was November now, and I still wasn't sure I had the right to it. She was a widow with a history that wasn't settled, and I was a man with a ranch I half-owned and a life that hadn't had room in it for much more than cattle and fences for a long time. It seemed like something that could go wrong in a dozen ways. But there was that stew on the stove and the coffee poured before I'd even come through the door, and there was the fact that she'd come into the doorway to watch me stand down a deputy for her sake. And there was the way she'd said, "I think you're the best man I've known," like she was giving me something she'd been keeping carefully, and had decided I was worth the risk of giving. I said that night before she'd gone to bed, "I want to ask you something." She said, "All right." I said, "Do you want to stay here? Not as someone I'm paying to keep the house, but because you want to." She was quiet for a moment. The lamp was burning between us, and the shadows moved on the wall, and the loose shutter knocked in the wind. She said, "I've wanted to stay since the first week. I just didn't let myself think about it because I didn't think you'd want me once you knew." I said, "I know now." She said, "Yes." I said, "And I'm asking now." She looked at me across the lamp. Her face was still and clear, and there was nothing guarded in it, no careful stillness, just her face. She said, "Then yes, I want to stay." We married in March. Small thing, the preacher came out to the ranch, and Nora's friend from Burrow Creek and my neighbor Jim Alcott were witnesses, and afterward there was a dinner that Nora and Jim's wife put together, and it was better food than I'd eaten in years, which was saying something since Nora had been feeding me for 6 months by then, and I'd been eating well. Jim shook my hand and said I looked different than I had a year ago. I asked him different how. He said, "Like a man who's got somewhere to be." I thought about that. He was right, that was the thing that had changed. For 9 years I'd been going through the motions of a life, working the land, keeping the cattle, fixing what broke, sleeping in a house that was too big for one person, and doing it all without any particular feeling that it was for something other than just continuing to do it. A habit of survival without much survival being at stake. What Nora had given me without meaning to, without it being something she'd planned, was the feeling that there was a reason to come back from the high pasture, a reason to fix the roof before winter, A reason to care about what the ranch looked like, and whether it was running right, and whether the cattle made it through the cold. She was the reason. Not because I needed her to cook or keep the house. I'd managed that badly on my own for years. But because she was there and she'd chosen to be there, and she'd done it knowing the full situation, knowing the kind of man I was and the kind of life this was, and she'd chosen it anyway. That's not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. The business with Millhaven resolved itself that spring. The cousin in Cheyenne had done a proper accounting of Lewis Haynes's estate, found that there was nothing of Nora's mixed in with it, and filed the appropriate paperwork closing the matter. Roy Decker never came back. The people in Millhaven who'd wanted to make a story out of Nora found that distance made it easier to let the story die. Nora started teaching reading at the Burrow Creek schoolhouse on Thursday mornings. She was good at it, the way I'd told her she'd be, patient in a way that worked on children and old men equally. I drove her in sometimes, and sometimes she took the horse and buggy herself. She started coming home later and later as more people found out she was there and started showing up, not all of them children. She came home one evening in April lit up in a way I hadn't seen and said, "A man came in today, 50-some years old, worked a ranch his whole life, never learned to read. He read his first sentence out loud today." She said he cried a little. He was embarrassed, but he cried. I said, "What did you do?" She said, "I kept going with the lesson. I didn't make a thing of it." I said, "Good." She looked at me and that slow smile came. She said, "You would have done the same." I said, "Probably." She sat down beside me on the porch step, close enough that her shoulder was against mine, and we looked out at the ranch in the evening light, the grass still winter pale but greening at the edges, the cattle moving slow in the far pasture, old Ira standing at the fence with his head down. She had her hands folded in her lap, and after a while she leaned her head against my shoulder just slightly and stayed there. I don't know what I looked like in that moment to anyone who might have been watching. A man sitting on his porch in the spring evening with his wife leaning against him. An ordinary thing, an ordinary life. But I knew what I was. I was a man who'd been living half a life for 9 years and hadn't known it, because you can't see the shape of a hole from inside it. I was a man who a good woman had looked at straight on, knowing his history and his debts and his silences and the rough edges that don't go away with age, and had decided was worth staying for. Ira lifted his head and looked at us. Then he put it back down and went on with whatever an old mule thinks about in the evening light. The cottonwoods along the draw were coming into leaf. The air had the smell of turned earth and new grass. Nora's shoulder was warm against mine. I thought, this is what they mean when they say a man's life is his own. Not the land, not the work, this. I sat with it. That was enough.